Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. Delighted to have with us for the first time, I can't believe she hasn't been with us before, Neera Tanden, who is the president of CAP. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm surprised it's
Oh,
like taken so long, Jen Rubin.
I know we've both been busy. Neera, of course, was in the administration, the Biden administration for 4 years. She was also in prior administrations, but she is now back at CAP, which I think is probably the premier center left think tank in town. So we're always happy to talk to her. Let's talk tariffs for a moment.
Mhm.
This seems to be a terrible self-own by the administration. The markets have tanked. We now have the IMF saying we're headed for a worldwide slowdown. Prices were supposed to be coming down, said they're going up. What's going on? And do you think that's sort of permeated to the average person now who understands that maybe things are not going to get better under Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think this is a function of people drinking their own Kool-Aid. You know, the president has been talking about tariffs for a really long time, and he, I think, has sort of bought his own BS this election and thought what people really were supporting was his economic program, when really I think a lot of people thought he was going to bring down prices, not raise them. And he has eliminated any advisors around him who could say, tanking the global economy is probably a bad idea. And now we were living with the results, which is this is the first time in my lived experience that you have a economic shock to the system that is the product of one guy,
Right.
one person on the global stage deciding that he's going to introduce tariff policy that is worse than Smoot-Hawley from the 1920s, which did help bring a depression to our country. He's going to have policies that raise prices, destabilize America's global leadership by essentially making our economy kind of function like a like emerging market where we take terrible policies and then people just basically pull their money out of the American economy. So it's really an incredible trifecta of terrible ideas. It increases prices, or just, I think our analysis is that these tariffs will drive $4,600 in additional cost to families. It
Wow.
is, so that's number one. It hurts people, just hurts families, hurts businesses. It at the highest macroeconomic level, it makes America weaker globally. It hurts our ability to compete, but also just makes people want to invest less in the United States because they think we're not a really stable, serious economy anymore. The dollar is falling, the bond market is really challenged, which doesn't usually happen when the stock market declines. So we are in, really a series of economic woes. And then, of course, jobs are decreasing because people are worried about the tariffs. They're not, companies are choosing not to go forward with building plants they otherwise would. So it's kind of a fascinating moment to see so much economic dislocation, raising prices, lowering jobs, and uh, destabilizing America's global leadership and fundamentally hurting us economically. But there, one man and one person, Donald Trump, is doing all of that at once.
In any oligarchy worth its salt, there is always corruption. And part of what the gambit in tariffs is that companies or individuals can come to the administration and say, give me a break, give me an exemption. So, for example, take Elon Musk, for example.
Mhm.
Tesla's might not have much of a tariff impact, or another company comes to him and doesn't have much of an impact. How much of this is also feeds into the sense that this is a billionaire, somewhat corrupt to very corrupt administration in which even the free market, something Republicans used to be in favor, is now terribly distorted by political favoritism, cronyism.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously that the fact that big businesses can get exemptions, but small businesses can't, the fact that donors can get exemptions, but others can't, the fact that all of this feeds the kind of conception of him as some imperial actor where people have to, basically beg the king for some deliverance from the punishment. You know, uh, uh, I mean, what's weird about America is we kind of fought a war of liberation against a king who did things like this. So, it's a little strange to be back here. But I think really the thing that's important for us to emphasize and is there are people who voted for Donald Trump and aren't as upset about his personal corruption as say I am, or maybe you are. But they are facing higher prices, higher much more anxiety about their job because again, it is one person deciding to drive a Mack truck into America's economy based on this like believing his own BS. So I think it is really important that this is like a moment for the Republican Party who used to think that free markets were important and that you didn't want corrupt state actors deciding who wins and loses. I mean, does anyone remember Solyndra? Where these people were like, oh my God, it's so terrible that the federal government would choose a particular company that
Yes.
went under. And here he's doing that like 5 times a day. And it's not just companies, it's countries. But putting all that aside, at the end of the day, the truth is that he is raising prices for people because he fundamentally believes that he can fool people. I mean, it's like the greatest con that has ever been perpetrated on the working class people, which is to say, I'm going to have an administration that dramatically cuts taxes on the wealthiest Americans in this country. And I'm going to get working class people to support it. And I'm going to do things like tariffs, which raise prices for them and cut Medicaid for working class people while I pay for a tax cut for the wealthiest Americans. It is the largest scale movement of wealth from middle class people to the wealthiest among us perpetrated by any person in our history. And we all have the collective power to stop it.
And that's where I want to go next, which is these cuts that would be necessary in order to, I don't even want to say pay for tax cuts because they're still not going to be paid for. The debt is going to go through the roof. 800 billion for Medicaid. That's roughly 1 in 4 people get some sort of health care from Medicaid. We're talking about Head Start. We're talking about the entire Department of Education. We're talking about massive layoffs in the private sector because they are dependent upon government contracts. Talking about technology grants, science slowed. What is the magnitude, and how do you describe that to the average person? Maybe someone isn't on Medicaid, or maybe they don't realize what Medicaid covers. How do you explain the enormity of these cuts to what it means to them? Do you have to boil it down to an individual basis? How do
Yes.
you punch
So,
through?
I think this is such an interesting conversation because I'm sure you hear a lot of the time like where are our leaders on these issues? But you know what it turns out? It turns out the most persuasive piece of information for people is how a person who looks like them, feels like them, could be their neighbor, how they are affected by a policy. So, you know, I say this all the time. Trump does all kinds of crazy, all kinds of crazy. And you as an opposition, we have to be strategic in thinking about how we are communicating what he is doing and what he is trying to do. And we here at Cap Action and the Center for American Progress are hyper focused on drawing the link between what Donald Trump is doing, whether it's Medicaid cuts or Doge and the impact that that will have, not just on the federal workers, which is crucially compelling, but on how it risks your family's health, your child's education, your job, to have this level of sort of chaotic cuts across the board. And then we are also laser focused on tariffs and the places where he is cutting jobs. He may end our investments in solar and wind over the next week or so. We have to have the discipline and focus, not to chase every story, but to really say to the American people and to individuals, you are experiencing higher costs for the toys you go buy in the store. You know, well, who did that to you? Donald Trump, because he has a tariff fantasy that will make people, he's trying to create like toy production in the United States. That is a fantasy. You are an experiment for him, and he is willing to have you pay higher prices for his, you know, ideological kind of weird fantasy of what America should be.
On the other side, in government, you know sometimes how difficult it is to break through the noise. You know that corporate media chases shiny objects or tends to make everything a competitive race as opposed to looking at real people and the effects on real people. What what can we reasonably expect from Democrats who are in the minority, but nevertheless do have the bully pulpit? And how do you think they're progressing as time goes on? We definitely sense, at least in our coverage, that there's much more energy, much more focus than there was 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. What would you say to Democratic office holders about focus, about conveying this message, and continuing to put responsibility back on not only Trump, but the Republicans who have done nothing, who could take back the tariff power? They haven't. That's their choice.
Yes, I think first and foremost, we have to make this clear every day. There are one set of actors that can stop Donald Trump and what he's doing. And that set of actors are the Republican leadership in Congress, in the House, and in the Senate. And Americans have to recognize that, like, I understand people are scared. And when people are scared, they want leadership. And I will say, I think leadership has really changed. I think a lot of people thought this was sort of normal politics. And, in my view, this is a real dividing line, whether you think we're in sort of normal politics or in radical politics. And, what I see is I see an administration that looks at America as a battlefield. And they are not just advancing their own army, but they are strategically going after what they consider the assets of the opposition. And that is why they are targeting the media. They are targeting law firms. They are targeting universities. They are probably targeting not-for-profits and foundations. And they want to reassemble what America looks like. And so we are in a not 4-year fight, or in my view, even a 2-year fight. We are in a month's fight to essentially provide courage to people to stand up. That is why I think it is really important that Harvard stood up to Trump. And
Yeah.
they do seem to be getting some response. And why I say this in response to Democratic leadership is I think this translates to Democrats as well. People have to recognize we are not in normal politics. And I think what creates fear and even anger is when people look at leaders and they seem like they're dealing with normal politics and a regular vote when we're really not in that space. But I think the good news is more and more leaders are seeing it that way. They are doing really extraordinary things. Senator Booker and his leadership, Senator Van Hollen going to El Salvador. And in the last 2 weeks of recess, we've had recess for last week and this week. And you're seeing Democrats hold town halls in Republican districts and getting hundreds and hundreds of people there
Right.
to communicate their message. They're doing things differently. And, it is very frustrating that they are in the minority. And I also would say to all the Democrats out there who are angry and frustrated, it is really important to hold Democrats accountable. But you cannot forget that we need two things: a united front countries that survive authoritarian threat are those that develop a united front. So we need to shore up that united front. Picking ourselves apart is actually what Trump wants us to do. So hold leaders accountable for sure, but let's build a united front and also pull in people into that united front that, open our tent up to people who may be opposed. So you may disagree on tax policy or some other things, but like when a person is changing their mind around Donald Trump, it's easy to say, what's wrong with you? Why did you do that? Why didn't you figure this out before? I get that anger, but actually it's a lot more helpful to saving our country if you actually open up your arms and say, I'm glad you're here.
Couldn't have said it any better. Well, we're going to continue to file and follow all of the twists and turns. I think the one thing we are seeing is that the public, as is often the case, is sometimes ahead of the politicians, and the amount of grassroots enthusiasm is extraordinary. And we've tried to
Absolutely.
make the point, we cover it regularly, that the amount of on the ground organizing and action is actually more intense, more widespread in this period of time than it was in the first Trump term. And that may not be covered in the same way.
Absolutely.
The media may get distracted, but it does have kind of a virtuous circle. People get active, politicians realize they got to wake up. They wake up, it encourages the public. So we're all in favor of the virtuous circle here. Thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing at CAP. Always a great reservoir of political information, but also policy ideas, so that when Democrats get back in power, they'll have some constructive things to do. So we'll look forward to having you again.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Jennifer.